Dr. Vera Songwe is the Undersecretary General of United Nations and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission of Africa. Upon her appointment, she became the first woman to lead the institution in its 60-year history. As Executive Secretary, Dr. Songwe's reforms have focused on ideas for a prosperous Africa and have brought to the fore critical issues of macroeconomic stability, development finance, private sector growth, poverty and inequality, the digital transformation, trade and competitiveness. Recently listed as one of Africa's 50 most powerful women by Forbes, named as one of the 100 most influential Africans by Jeune Afrique in 2019, 100 most influential Africans by New Africa magazine in 2017, and one of the 25 Africans to watch by the Financial Times in 2015. Dr. Songwe is acknowledged for her long-standing track record of providing policy advice and her wealth of experience in delivering development results for Africa. She's written extensively on the development and economic issues, including debt, infrastructure development, fiscal and governance issues. She's well published and contributes to the development debate across the broad spectrum of platforms, including in the Financial Times. Prior to ECA, she held a number of senior leadership roles in International Finance Corporation and the World Bank. And one last thing I want to add is she's also an alum of the University of Michigan, so which is a great pleasure to host you, Dr. Songwe. Love to hear, eager to hear from you, your thoughts around the intersection of healthcare, economic development. Over to you, Dr. Songwe.
Thank you so very much, Ravi. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I start where you left off. Of course, I am Wolverine and go blue, and so it's a pleasure to come back, even if virtually, to this forum today to talk about that intersection, as you say, between economics, healthcare, and of course, something that none of us can get away from, which is the COVID-19 crisis and Africa's reaction to that. There has been a lot that has been said about whether Africa is doing well or not doing well, or whether Africa has been resilient and responded to the crisis. But given that I'm talking to healthcare specialists, I'm going to leave the conjectures, suggestions, and ideas of why we may or may not be doing very well to you. I think that a couple of ideas have already been put forth. One of them is that we are a population that is probably over-vaccinated, and so the combination of all the different vaccines we've been taking maybe is providing some kind of resilience. I think we were also quite fortunate because the pandemic got to the continent a little bit later than it did to many other places, so we were able to watch and observe the responses and the reactions. I remember we had a big workshop with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, where the pandemic was just getting to the continent and Spain was just about to start opening up, but they had gone through almost 2.5 months of lockdown. And so I think that by the time it got to the continent, the issues of wearing masks, we were following the science, let me put it like this. We were wearing masks, we were washing our hands where possible, there was social distancing. And now our economies, I think, actually locked down a little bit earlier than most other economies. So Africa has succeeded in being resilient. And finally, we were also able to get PPE kits quite early in the process, as opposed to many countries that were struggling for 2-3 months to get PPEs. What I'm suggesting to do today is to just talk through a little bit what the pharmaceutical health scene on the continent looks like, what the challenges that COVID has unearthed are, and then how Africa is responding to that, and how the conversation around both our new trade deal, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, comes into this conversation on supply chains, but how we are also looking at reshaping and redesigning the healthcare architecture on the continent. So let me start by talking about where were we before COVID started. And essentially, I'll give 3 big messages. We had just launched a process of saying, healthcare is an important part of Africa's economy. Healthcare is going to be a determining factor, both on the fiscal side, but also on the business side. One, on the fiscal side, because we were, as Africa and as one of the premier think tanks on the continent, we started asking ourselves the question, what should Africa's healthcare strategy be? And can Africa afford to have all of its healthcare being on public provision? So we had looked at these pieces of work and realized that though our healthcare sector needed opening up, it needed to re-invite the private sector in. At the same time, our leaders had just passed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which meant that we had opened a larger market for the healthcare space. And so there was opportunity to crowd in more private sector. So we started some work on what is, how we could anchor the CFTA, which was this large, 1.3 billion market, in a pharmaceutical initiative on pool procurement and again on local production. How many African pharmaceutical companies did we have, and what could we do to have more pharmaceutical companies? Of course, the result of that was that there's a lot of potential on the continent. We are looking to crowd in more foreign direct investment into the space, but we have to, first of all, understand that space. So all this work we had done before the crisis, before COVID-19. And in February, when we were launching our report, COVID-19 happened. But just to give you a sense of what the report was saying, essentially, Africa was importing a lot of its pharmaceutical products from abroad. Between 2016 and 2018, we were importing over 96% of our pharmaceutical products from outside the continent, 51% from the European Union, 19% of all pharmaceutical commodities consumed on the continent were coming from India, 9% from other countries, 5% from China, 4% from the United States, 3% from the UK. So essentially, the European Union, India, and if you put together the US and the UK, we're taking over somewhere in the order of 90%, 80% of all of our pharmaceutical imports. So again, a huge chunk of the pharmaceutical consumption on the continent was coming from outside. 71 countries, when the crisis happened, imposed restrictions on pharmaceutical products, on medical products, on PPEs, including the European Union space, by the way, and of course, India, next slide, were one of the ones that imposed those restrictions. So it was good that we kind of had a sense, next slide, of where we wanted to go and what were we doing. Now we had our markets, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and we said, can we get together and understand within this 1.3 billion market, where can we begin to look for more production of pharmaceutical products on the continent? How can we ensure then that the supply chain, which is a conversation that we're having today, is reinforced intracontinentally? Today, only we trade amongst ourselves 18 to 20%. And the question was, the reason why our leaders decided to create the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement was to see whether we can increase the value addition on the continent before we export outside the continent. To increase that value addition on the continent, you need to develop continental supply chains. You need to ensure that that supply chain process is working well. Now, in some sense, fortuitously, one of the biggest impacts of the COVID-19 was to disrupt global supply chains. So it was very difficult. The Suez Canal, 14.5% of Egypt's GDP comes from the Suez Canal, for example, and all of that disappeared because there was no longer this global trading activity that was happening. A lot of the activity had now been localized or nationalized, if you want. And so what we were able to do then was say, how can we use this as an opportunity to see how we can then actually foster and continue the conversation around building regional and sub-regional supply chain. So the idea again behind the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is to say, we create more markets internally, we create more value on the continent, and then we export. What a lot of work that the ECA has done shows is that when Africa exports to the United States, Africa creates the most value. So we have the highest value addition on the continent when we are exporting to the United States. So we need Africa to be able to enter and be part of US supply chains. But we want to be able to get into those supply chain systems when we have produced something on the continent and added sufficient value. The second time when Africa adds the most value is when we trade amongst ourselves. And I think a lot of that is because there is a learning process that happens when we trade intra-Africa. And then there is, of course, a growing process when we trade extra-Africa into particularly the United States. It's interesting that the European Union only comes third in that value addition process. And of course, China As we all know, Africa mostly exports raw commodities to China. So there is almost little to no value addition, no learning, and no knowledge. So very difficult then to develop or grow up the value chain in that sort of exports towards China. And so there is no value creation. Yes, we're in almost every value chain that goes into the East, but we are really not creating much value. What we would like to do is to say, create more value on the continent, and then probably continue to go east and of course go more west. Now, and I will show you how we are already beginning to do that because of COVID-19. The ambition around the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is a huge one. We have an ambition that says that, you know, if we are able actually, as we speak today, we're very excited on the continent because one of our largest, second largest country, I should say one of our largest countries, Nigeria, has finally agreed and is signing and ratifying the CFTA. That really now makes it, when we start talking about, you know, in an ambitious scenario, we will be looking at adding somewhere in the order of $43 billion to global trade. As we do this, you know, we can say that I think with a little bit more certainty, because Nigeria is now part of this global experiment or continental experiment that we're doing. There are a number of countries and a number of products where we believe that we can actually get into that value chain. The first one of them, or one of the more important ones, is the energy sector. A lot of the work that we're talking about and post-crisis, as we begin to think about building forward better, there is a lot of a conversation around sustainability, ensuring that we're building into a more green economy, ensuring that we're building towards net zero. And a lot of that, particularly on the African continent, where we do not yet have, you know, only 50% of Africa has access to electricity. The rest of Africa does not have access to electricity. This is a number that we talk about quite often. We rarely talk about access to energy for the business sector. The productive sectors are even more handicapped because they don't have access to the right energy. And just to give you orders of magnitude, the energy that we need for all of our productive sectors is 12% of what is used in China, for example, same populations. And so it begins to give you a sense of why even production is so difficult on the continent, because we do not have access to energy. However, because of the crisis and because Africa is endowed with so much raw and natural resources, we can actually begin to do that. Why is this important for a supply chain? When we start talking about the energy sector, particularly as we talk about renewables, we start talking about windmills, we start talking about solar panels, we start talking, and then you start thinking production. And can Africa now get into some of those supply chain production systems for windmills, for solar panels? We know that in the beginning, when there was sort of the emergence of the solar systems, it actually started in Spain, and then Europe was sort of the leader. The Chinese and the Indians now do more solar panels. Can we relocalize a lot of that? Because a lot of the raw material actually does exist on the continent. You go to something, technology and phone equipment. A lot of our phones now use coltan as part of the sort of raw material. Each one of us that has a phone has some part of the Democratic Republic of Congo's coltan in that phone. However, the Democratic Republic of Congo does not process any coltan at all. So the total exports of coltan from the Democratic Republic of Congo are somewhere in the order of $8.3 billion. The value addition through the coltan process into a phone today is somewhere in the order of 1.2 trillion. So just to give you a sense of the magnitudes of what you can get in terms of value addition. But when we talk about value addition on the continent, yes, we're talking about increased GDP per capita, we're talking about increased incomes, which are particularly important because we want to raise and decrease, we want to decrease poverty. But in between that is jobs. And the African continent today, we need to create 13 million jobs a year just to be able to, and we, in the United States, I think we're all looking at the job numbers every quarter to see whether they're going up or whether they're going down, whether the economy is booming. On the continent, we're exactly in that situation where we need to understand, you know, in countries like South Africa, you have almost 30% unemployment. In countries like North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, unemployment numbers are 25%. And this is we have those numbers because these countries are actually taking stock of them. If you look at, you know, Senegal and Kenya, maybe the unemployment numbers are 18, 19%, but there is a huge sort of underemployment So you may be employed and you may be reporting employment. A lot of the people work in the agriculture sector, so they're employed for only 6 months in a year. And so underemployment is actually quite large. So if you marry the unemployment number with the underemployment number on the continent, you end up with quite substantial amount of people that are not fully and gainfully employed. And so we believe that by being able to start multiplying production processes on the continent, we can actually do more of that. Now, the other thing that we're looking at with this value addition is to say, how can we bring together specializations and areas of specialization so that if we want to do something, we find 4 or 5 countries that become the leaders or the champions of that. And that's what we're doing in the health sector. And I go back to the health sector in particular. So as I said, Africa imports 70% of its pharmaceuticals at the price of about $14.5 billion. This is just the raw pharmaceutical sector. Our health sector is estimated at 259 billion. Just to give you a sense of, we are about 20% of the global population. We only produce 2% of the health commodities that we consume. And so essentially there's a huge imbalance in terms of the relationships between what we produce and what we consume, and then the unemployment. So it doesn't make that much sense that we are not producing and consuming what we need. We already have centers of excellence on the continent for health and pharmaceutical production. One of them, of course, is Egypt. Another one is Kenya. South Africa, of course. Johnson & Johnson is just about to move there. So we're getting a lot of the larger US and multinational firms relocating into South Africa. In West Africa, you have, of course, Nigeria, a big powerhouse, Cameroon, and to some extent, Ivory Coast. So there are a number of countries where there is already a beginning of a pharmaceutical sector, but we have not yet been able to really create a supply chain from beginning to end. A lot of, and one of what COVID-19 brought to light was that a lot of the intermediary goods that we use, even in the existing, the thin existing pharmaceutical sector on the continent, are imported. So even though there was a lot of conversation about, not stopping the exports of the raw materials, a country like China ran out of some of the sort of, what do you call them, the entrance into a lot of the pharmaceutical commodities. So even there, we couldn't get access to them to be able to produce what we did on the continent. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to close that. Now, countries are spending quite an amount of money on healthcare, but there is still a big health financing gap. And so one of the other things that we need to do is also to think of how do you crowd in the private sector? Because we're importing a lot of our pharmaceutical commodities, because a lot of that is going through public budgets, there is not enough efficiency in the use of those resources. So again, we believe that if we relocalize continentally, not nationally, but continentally or sub-regionally, some of those supply chains, we will actually be able to close the health financing gap, but increase the efficiency of health spending on the continent. Next slide, please. So this is one of the things that we're trying to do, is say, how can we ensure that we bring more of the private sector in, but target it into the sectors where we need the private sector. When we look at where is the private sector in Africa today, the private sector in the healthcare space is mostly in service provision. They are not in production of commodities. However, when you look at the financing budget for the healthcare sector, it's mostly in the procurement of commodities. So there is a little bit of an imbalance in the system. And so we wanted to see whether we can do a little bit more of that balancing. We have a lot of the private sector, so they own hospitals, they own clinics. We have some private sector that is now beginning to provide healthcare insurance. We have a healthcare sector, a growing ICT and technology healthcare sector, but as you see, there is no production in that bubble. So we need to be able to, whereas production is the largest component of where Africa spends a lot of its resources when you come to the healthcare space. So again, an imbalance, but part of this is because of regulation. It's easier, the regulation to provide healthcare services and open a hospital is easier. The regulation to open an insurance company is easier. The ICT, we don't yet have good penetration. Our broadband capacity is weak. Our regulation is not so good, so you only have 8%, but it's growing. 2 or 3 years ago, it was about 2-3%. I think that many more countries, Kenya, Rwanda, of course, Tunisia, Morocco, South Africa, are beginning to open the ICT space. So we're beginning to see much more healthcare provision on technology platforms. COVID, I think when we take this number in the next year or two, would have exploded this number because everybody now is doing healthcare from home. We're all consulting from home. We're all doing this on our laptops, including in the rural areas in Rwanda with some amazing experiments that are happening out there. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to give you a sense of where is the private sector already when we start talking about supply chain linkages and where we can bring in additional private sector into these conversations. We begin to see where we are on the continent in terms of service provision, in terms of value addition, and in terms of job creation. Next slide, please. So what did we decide to do and what is the AFCFTA anchored initiative? Essentially, it said one of the ways of being able to, because Africa is a continent with 54 countries, very difficult to bring in the private sector and build the supply chain in some of the markets because they're quite small. Very difficult also for some of the markets to be able to actually procure on a sustainable basis because they're quite small. So the idea was to say, can we begin to do markets and pooling regions? Can we pool procurement? We already realize in Ethiopia, for example, and at the University of Michigan, a lot of work that is being done together with you in countries like Ethiopia. When you do pool procurement, we're able to save almost 22% of the budget, which is $570 million on procurement. Huge amounts of resources that now you can use to ensure that service delivery, service supply is much more efficient. There is in the Southern African Development Community as well, a pool procurement program that is increasing market efficiency, is ensuring that we can create more businesses and build more markets. I give you an example of why pool procurement is very important. On the continent, a country like Seychelles is one of the countries with quite a GDP per capita of over $18,000, but nobody wants to sell drugs to Seychelles. It's a nice, beautiful island. We all want to go there for vacation, but it's too costly to distribute drugs in Seychelles. So a drug that you can buy in Ethiopia for $4 cost about $18 in Seychelles because of the additional cost of transportation. So what we're doing is trying to ensure that we do pool procurement so that that can work. The next thing that we're working on is local production. How can we develop local supply chains? Something like when you look at a lot of the anesthesias and the different kinds of antibiotic drugs, you know, Kenya is has taken the lead on the production of antibiotic drugs, but Egypt has a lot of the raw materials and has a lot of the know-how. Can we create a value chain and a supply chain that makes that work? And then you have the logistics, where logistics is quite advanced in Southern Africa. And so you begin to build that value addition within the continent before you export some of those drugs outside the continent. So that is the initiative actually that the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, is doing. We're working, of course, as part of this process, we're also looking at counterfeit drugs. It is the supply chain, is also the distribution and ensuring that we're distributing the right drugs. We're working with companies like Pfizer to begin to build in systems that can ensure that you're looking at the right drugs and working on the right things. But I just wanted to give you a sense of how we take one value chain or one commodity and work through it, and where the different nodes of the sort of supply chain system work, but also to re-emphasize the point that the supply chain is not just on the production side, but also on the services and the logistics are part of the conversation. And for us on the continent, we're looking at it again as value addition, value creation, prosperity, but also jobs. So every node in that supply chain for us is a job. And the question is always, how can we create an additional job to ensure that, you know, we are bringing everybody, as we say with the SDGs, we're leaving nobody behind. So this is a quick, I hope, but the very visual example of where and why the CFTA is important, how you create larger markets because of the CFTA, how you leverage competitive advantages across the continent to then finally ensure that we can actually export goods that would be able to get into the US market. And remember, when we export to the US, we create the most value. So the speed at which growth goes up is probably higher if we're able to do that in a couple of other sectors as we go forward. On the trade conversation, of course, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The US is trying to negotiate something with Africa. We are hoping that, you know, whatever the trade negotiation that happens with the continent happens in the context of our African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and comes to strengthen it. There is the AGOA AGOA is already sort of the basis for the trade discussions between Africa and the United States. And we hope that we can continue to strengthen that in more areas, but particularly focusing on value addition. Today, AGOA is mostly on the energy and the oil sector, so we're not adding any value when we do that, and we would like to change that as we go forward. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to listening and answering questions if there may be any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Songwe. Wonderful to hear your remarks, to take this at a more macro level and connect, healthcare with economic development, because one thing that the pandemic has really highlighted across the globe is how interconnected they are. When you don't have public health supply chains that work effectively, economies shut down. I mean, we've seen this not just, in every part of the world. We see this in the United States in developed countries, but we also see in developing countries. And it's even more stark in the developing countries because of just the large populations dependent on, informal sector or small and medium sector, not digitally ready, because there are many, many jobs that cannot be done remotely. Many of us are very, very fortunate enough to continue our jobs remotely. So wonderful to hear some of these opening comments. We do have some questions that have come in, but before I kind of, forward those questions to you, I was just curious a little bit if you could talk, because developing a digital infrastructure, this COVID has highlighted very strongly what that is. And the second aspect, if you might be able to address this, is, you're talking private sector development is extremely important. And this is one of the issues that we have tried to focus in this conference through curated sessions, bringing in the early days of this conference, it was mostly talk about public sector, because health provision in most of Africa is through the public sector. And we have, through curated sessions, keynote speakers, and panels, talk about the role of private sector, talk about the challenges. So you're right on the dot in terms of emphasizing that. But one of the issues that we've been thinking about is how can we leverage the development aid that comes into health, which is huge, to develop the private sector. So this is kind of, instead of just doing, because take, for example, logistics, transport, third-party logistics, these could be, even though they're downstream, more service sector, those could be leveraged to develop the private sector within the continent. So two issues, the digital infrastructure and what could be done, as well as leveraging development aid. And then I will parse through the Q&A box and forward you some of the questions from the audience.
No, thank you. Thank you. Those are two important questions. Let me start with the leveraging development aid question, and it will allow me to cheat a little bit and talk about something which is very topical, which is, of course, the vaccines and the conversation around vaccines. And I link this to development aid and how we can leverage it better and differently. So when we look at, the conversations today around, will Africa get vaccines? How many vaccines? What percentage? There is a lot of conversation about development aid. Of course, we've all heard and are all very grateful with the $12 billion that the World Bank is providing, the COVAX facility is providing. The COVAX facility is this group of donors that have come together to say that they will guarantee that Africa at least has 20% of the vaccines for essential workers and the elderly that need them. However, all of this is saying, we'll get, whatever the vaccine that is successful to be produced in India, and then we will ship it to the continent. And we're saying, no, we can actually produce the vaccine on the continent. So why don't we get into public-private partnerships with some of these businesses, and rather than use the cost of producing in India and then transporting to the continent, why don't we use that as a kind of guarantee or as a trade finance resources, so that a company like Johnson & Johnson can come and open up in South Africa and produce on the continent and allow us then to develop those capacities to produce more. The cost, because of the vaccines and the sort of new technology that is being used for these vaccines, apparently the freezing temperatures for which you need to sort of move the vaccines is incredible. And so it cost about $2 billion to just move those vaccines, right? $2 billion could set up companies across the continent on pharmaceutical. Exactly. So those are the kinds of things we're now looking at, is to say, well, if you're willing to put together $2 billion to ship the vaccines from the UK or the United States or China or India, bring the $2 billion to the continent. Your supply chain will be shorter because you're just shipping from Kenya to South Africa, or, you know, and so essentially you're also building business. So that really is the answer to your question. And I wanted to use something which is so topical and so current. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. And Johnson & Johnson, I must say, has responded. AstraZeneca and a couple of other companies are looking at the continent. There's some looking at Kenya. So already you're seeing now that we're using the concessional financing of public donor money to crowd in the private sector on the continent for production, for job creation, and of course for R&D, which will allow us then to begin to grow into a larger and more effective pharmaceutical sector. On the ICT question, I think, again, across the system, in the health sector, in the education, we have 330 million kids that were going to school on the continent. Almost 90% of them no longer go to school because they can't do it on the internet. So one of the big things that we're trying to do is to say, how can we increase broadband? How can we reduce cost so that you can increase efficiency, increase access? There has been for a very long time conversations about Africa having access to telephones. But actually, we just recently launched a program called the African Communications and Informations Platform. I must say that I was pretty disappointed because we were hoping that a lot of the phones on the continent were Androids. No, only about 18% of the phones on the continent are Androids, which means only 18% of the people who have phones on the continent can actually use their phones to access the internet. The rest of them cannot. And so again, I think we celebrated too early sort of the achievement of internet connectivity. We are not connected on the continent, and we need to do a lot more. We need to do a lot better. The thing that COVID has done, it has shown us that there's so many more services that we can do with the internet. And the businesses on the continent that have survived are all businesses that were already connected. And we've just run a quick survey of businesses that are doing better and coming out of this crisis. It is the same across the world, by the way. So we are not sort of an outlier in that case. But I think it has also sent a message to our policymakers that they need to accelerate the pace of internet connectivity and open up the regulatory framework for internet connectivity on the continent. There has been, of course, the big discussion on information, private information, and you know, what part of information is private and what part is not. The Economic Commission for Africa and the African Union have written a strategy, or the digital strategy for Africa, that begins to lay out what are the conditions for privacy around information and how you can use that for more market provision and more market services. Of course, building on cases like India and Estonia and other places that have done that.
Right. Thank you. So I'm looking through in the Q&A box. There are a few questions. I'll cluster them. One general theme seems to be, you spoke a lot about intracontinental trade, and obviously you also mentioned that there are regulatory barriers. So what is being done to bring down those regulatory barriers to facilitate that intracontinental trade? And let me add on to that, the other issue, I think the World Bank has talked about this. We can think about barriers both as soft and hard infrastructure issues. So what I mean by hard infrastructure issues is transport and other kinds of things, availability. You mentioned about, you know, intracontinental transport, but also soft in terms of, you know, the bureaucracy of how many signatures does it take to clear a container. I mean, you know, those kinds of issues, or, you know, cross-border trade. So, you know, perhaps a little bit of elaboration on what kind, you know, how is the regulatory barrier being addressed?
No, again, I think one of the things that you must commend the African leaders and our ministers of trade on, in particular, I use trade because I'm going to use a trade example, is that we have managed to use the COVID crisis to actually open up some of the areas where there were quite a number of regulatory barriers. And one of those has been on cross-border trade. Of course, with COVID, a lot of the trade on the continent happens by road, as in the United States, by the way. So there's trucks, you know, going, you know, from Kenya to Uganda to Rwanda and then down into South Africa. But with COVID, all of a sudden borders were closed, right? Almost 32 countries or a little bit more closed their borders. And so what we ended up having was tons of trucks in sort of lined up in the borders of every country and trying to understand how you get through. And actually, particularly in East Africa, one of the fastest sort of spreaders of COVID was truck drivers, going through different economies. And so leaders got together and decided, how can we do this better? How can we do this more efficiently? So actually, it wasn't a single customs post that accelerated the process. It was COVID. They needed to create a sort of single testing post. And as part of creating that emergency center, we were able to build in one-stop shops for customs. We were able to build in one-stop testing for customs. And so East Africa became quite advanced now in cross-border trading. We've now put up the Economic Commission for Africa, working with AUDA NEPA, the development arm of the African Union, have put together a sort of a template for what are the things that are needed. And the leaders, normally it takes a little bit longer for some of these policies to be passed, but because there was such an emergency, food prices were going up in countries because trucks were stuck at the borders and there was scarcity. And so some of these policies had to be put in place quite quickly. So in East Africa, a package of policies were immediately put in. They have facilitated COVID, but over the long term, they're going to facilitate cross-border trading. We have now taken that package that was used in East Africa, and we are trying to standardize it across the continent. So these are some of the things that are happening. Thank God, well, I don't know if you should say thank God, but as a result of COVID, we have benefited to actually accelerate a lot of the cross-border impediments that you had on the continent. Now, in areas like West Africa, where we already had sort of common market and movements of goods that were quite easy, the difficulty with the CFTA is now how we trade across regional economic communities. So it's not so much inside of West Africa, you trade well with each other. Inside of SADC and COMESA, that is also happening quite well. The question is, what do you do when you're looking at the cross-region? And that's where a lot of the work going forward will be focused, is can we standardize some of those processes? But I think with the CFTA and the plan to launch it in the 1st of January, we should be able to do a lot more of that. I want to close by saying that in the Doing Business Index, in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, there's always been at least 5 African countries in the top 10. So the good news there is that African countries realize they need to improve, they need to do better, and they are actually doing it. So there has been a steady increase and an improvement in the business environment in Africa. Of course, low, so it's going to take a lot of time to get to the frontier of Switzerland, but there is, I think, a dedicated and resolved effort to do that.
Great. Another question, you spoke a lot about, and this past response also, about regulatory barriers, but there's another question from an entrepreneur from India. It's talking about are we also thinking about incentives to organizations or companies to come set up something in Africa?
Well, I am not a fan of incentives, so I'm sorry to be quite honest about it. I think one of the things that we are actually arguing about is we need for every African country to calculate what we call tax expenditure. The other side of incentives is tax expenditure, which essentially is your revenue that you forgo in the name of bringing a company into the continent. I think what we have seen across the world, so this is not unique to Africa, is that you tend to give a lot more incentives when you don't have the right regulatory environment, when you don't have the right infrastructure, when you don't have the right human capacity. And so rather than use those resources to sort of give incentives to 1 or 2 companies, provide the energy. If you can provide the energy in a reliable and sustainable way, at a cost-effective way, companies will come. If you can provide the human capital and the skill in a reliable and sustainable way, companies will come. So incentives, it is true that the private sector loves incentives, but I think that we have proven in the business sector, and I'm sure even in the business school in Michigan, that incentives are a way it's a veneer on the imperfections in the economy. And so rather than continue to give incentives to every business, improve the imperfections. The interesting thing about incentives as well, as we all know, and it is also true in the United States, small and medium enterprises, national, local, small and medium enterprises are the job creators, are the providers of those value chains. They usually don't benefit from incentives because they are not FDI. And so essentially you give incentives to 2 or 3 large companies that come in. The small and medium enterprises of your economy that are essentially the drivers of your economy, the job creators of your economy, the value creation of your economy, do not benefit from any incentive. So it's a regressive policy that over the long run is not necessarily sustainable. And so I think that what we propose to governments is look at the areas where your private sector is saying you need to do better and improve in those areas, provide the right enabling environment, provide the right regulatory environment, and they will come.
Right. I mean, that's an excellent point to use the, if you think in terms of the money being fungible, to use that to develop local infrastructure so it becomes attractive enough for people to come and actually establish. And we've seen that obviously in the United States as well. Different states have approached this differently, incentives versus development, right? Another question that was, and this is from Cote d'Ivoire, so I'm using Google Translate to translate the question from French to English. I hope it comes through right. So the question was, really, you've talked a lot about private sector investment, but given the large presence of the public sector, especially in health, shouldn't the intermediate step be public-private partnership? Could you say something about, how do countries go about developing the public-private partnership space?
Yes, no, I think in one of the slides that I showed, we had sort of the public-private partnership space on the continent in the health sector. And so thank you for the questions. I don't know if you saw that to my colleague. I would speak in French, but then I don't think you will have Google Translate as I answer him in French. So I will answer the question in English. I think what we showed, and I even saw, I think, Professor taking pictures of that slide, we showed that what we are seeing is that there is a lot of public-private partnerships in the service provision, so in the hospital sector. There's a lot of public-private partnerships in the insurance sector. And so, yes, our governments need to do more. There's the slide, thank you. Our governments need to do more to see whether they can crowd in public-private partnerships already in the sectors, in the service provision in hospitals. Are the governments necessarily the best providers of hospitals? Maybe not. Maybe, they could continue. And Morocco is actually trying out this experiment where Morocco is building the hospitals, but then it is giving out leases to the private sector to run the hospitals with a series of KPIs. And so if you meet your KPIs after 5 years, your lease gets renewed. If you don't meet your KPIs after 5 years, we go to somebody else. So essentially, it's a public asset, but which is run and managed by the private sector. So there is a lot of that is beginning to happen, and we can do more. And then, of course, on the production side of the commodities and the drugs, that is, and of course, then the PPEs, that is more of a, I think, fully private initiative. When we talk about vaccines, it's also public-private. A lot of what is happening in South Africa today on the vaccine side is public-private initiatives. A lot of what is happening in Senegal and Kenya is also public-private initiative. So I think there is a little bit of both. There is a right balance, and we just need to ensure that the regulatory framework, and a very important thing, particularly in the health sector, is the regulatory system. Right. Because we're talking about drugs. If you have the wrong drugs that are manufactured, it's lives, that you need to save. So I think one of the areas where we need more work on the continent is, first of all, we're working as the Economic Commission for Africa to create actually one global regulatory authority, which we're calling the African Medical Association, that can regulate the pharmaceutical sector and the health sector. And then, of course, we have Africa CDC that has been doing a fantastic job in the response to COVID. But post-COVID has to look at sort of, what is the health response of the continent, working, of course, in close collaboration with Africa CDC and the other health institutions across the globe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songwe. That's all the time we have, attendees. Really would like to, again, thank you so much. Hope that, in the future, you'll be able to come in person and not only to our conference, but of course to Michigan as well, and welcome you back to campus. But thank you so much. I know the attendees are muted, so they can't do actually an applause, but we will do an applause for you, right? So thank you so much for taking.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to do something, of course, with my alma mater, and an important subject, which is both topical and important for all of us as we try to come out of this COVID-19 crisis. Stay safe, and look forward to continuing our collaboration with the Economic Commission for Africa and the University of Michigan. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songwe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.